It didn't begin with a public statement or a royal announcement, but with a quiet admission that snipped through elite circles like wildfire. After 3 decades of silence, Andrew Parker Bowles finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough. And what he revealed wasn't just about a failed marriage, it was about a truth the palace had buried in plain sight for years. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, his silence had been interpreted as dignity, as restraint, even as loyalty to a system that thrives on controlled narratives. But silence, as it turns out, can carry its own weight. It can conceal fractures, protect reputations, and preserve illusions that were never meant to last forever. And now, that carefully maintained silence has shifted just slightly, but enough to make people look back and question everything they thought they understood. Because when someone who has remained quiet for so long chooses to speak, even indirectly, it rarely happens without reason. Reports began surfacing quietly, passed between journalists, whispered among insiders, and dissected in private conversations that never made it to the front pages. They suggested that Andrew's perspective had never truly aligned with the public version of events that had been accepted for decades. That behind the composed appearances and the carefully managed image, there had always been something unresolved, something quietly acknowledged but never openly addressed. The timing of this so-called confirmation only deepened the intrigue. Why now? Why allow these fragments of truth to surface after so many years of restraint? Some insiders hinted that the shifting dynamics within the royal family had created a space where older narratives could no longer remain untouched. Others suggested that time itself had softened the consequences, making it easier for long-buried realities to emerge without causing immediate disruption. But perhaps the most unsettling part of all was not what was said, it was what was implied. Because the more people revisited the past, the more they began to notice the subtle inconsistencies that had once been dismissed. Moments that felt slightly out of place. Interactions that carried an undercurrent no one could quite explain. Early signs that, in hindsight, seemed almost impossible to ignore. The marriage between Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla had always been presented as stable, respectable, and aligned with the expectations of their world. Yet beneath that polished surface, there were always questions, quiet ones, carefully avoided, but never entirely erased. And now, with even the smallest crack appearing in that long-held silence, those questions are no longer easy to dismiss. Because this was never just about a divorce. It was about what led to it, what sustained it for as long as it lasted, and what ultimately made it impossible to continue. It was about understanding how a relationship that appeared so composed on the outside could carry so much complexity beneath it. And as these revelations begin to take shape, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the story that has been accepted for years may only be a fraction of the truth. But this wasn't just a story about a broken marriage, it was about a union shaped by secrets long before it ever began. Long before the wedding bells rang, there was already a presence inside their marriage, unseen, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Because Camilla didn't enter that union as a blank slate. She carried a history, a connection, one that would quietly follow her into every room, every moment, every silence. It is often suggested in royal circles that some relationships do not end, they simply change form, shifting into something less visible but no less powerful. And in this case, that lingering connection was not just emotional. It was deeply rooted in a world where proximity, familiarity, and shared history could never truly be erased. Not long before she became a central figure in the monarchy, Camilla had already formed a bond with Charles III, a bond that insiders have described as natural, effortless, and, perhaps most importantly, unfinished. That word unfinished would come to define everything that followed. At the time, however, the world looked very different. Expectations within aristocratic circles were rigid, almost suffocating in their precision. Marriages were not always about emotional alignment. They were about stability, compatibility on paper, and adherence to a system that had existed for generations. In that environment, Camilla's marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles was seen as entirely appropriate. He was respected, well-connected, and firmly rooted within the same social framework. On the surface, it made sense. It fulfilled the expectations of their world. It aligned with what was considered proper. But beneath that carefully constructed logic, There were quiet questions that were never openly asked, but never fully disappeared either. Timing, as many insiders have hinted, played a crucial role. The marriage happened at a moment when certain paths seemed closed and others, perhaps less certain, became necessary. There is a suggestion, often whispered, rather than stated outright, that circumstances surrounding royal expectations influenced decisions in ways that were not immediately visible. Because within the monarchy, personal choices are rarely just personal. They are shaped, guided, and sometimes constrained by forces far beyond individual control. And in that environment, emotions can become secondary to duty, even when they refuse to disappear entirely. In the early years of the marriage, everything appeared stable. Public appearances were composed, interactions measured, and the narrative remained intact. Yet behind that composed exterior, there were subtle signs that something was not entirely aligned. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be easily pointed to, but a quiet distance that seemed to exist beneath the surface. Reports from those familiar with their social circles suggest that while the marriage functioned, it did not always feel deeply connected. Conversations were polite, engagements fulfilled, but something essential seemed just out of reach. And that absence, however small, carried weight. What makes this even more complex is the idea of unresolved attachment. It is not something that announces itself loudly. It does not disrupt everything at once. Instead, it lingers in the background, shaping decisions in ways that are difficult to trace. Insiders have often hinted that the connection between Camilla and Charles was never entirely severed, even as life moved forward in different directions. It existed quietly, almost invisibly, influencing moments that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. And over time, that quiet influence became harder to ignore, because when something unresolved continues beneath the surface, it does not simply disappear. It grows. It evolves. It begins to affect the present in ways that only become clear in hindsight. And in this case, what began as a subtle undercurrent would slowly transform into something far more significant, something that would reshape not just a marriage, but an entire narrative that had once seemed so certain. And as the years passed, what began as whispers slowly turned into patterns no one could ignore. At first, it was easy to dismiss late arrivals, quiet absences, moments that didn't quite add up. But over time, those small inconsistencies formed a pattern that insiders now suggest painted a very different picture behind closed doors. In the beginning, nothing felt urgent, nothing demanded attention. A missed engagement here, a delayed appearance there, these were things easily explained away in a world where schedules were relentless and expectations unyielding. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves slowly, almost deliberately, as if waiting for the right moment to be noticed. And in this case, the pattern did not emerge all at once. It unfolded gradually, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. Those familiar with the inner workings of aristocratic life began to sense a shift. Not dramatic, not explosive, but unmistakable. The connection between Andrew Parker Bowles and Queen Camilla appeared to be evolving into something quieter, more distant. Publicly, they remained composed. Their appearances were measured, their interactions polite, their roles fulfilled with precision. But beneath that surface, there was an emotional distance that could no longer be hidden behind formality. It was subtle, almost invisible to those not looking for it. Yet to those who understood the nuances of their world, it spoke volumes. Reports began to circulate not loudly, not officially, but in the kind of quiet exchanges that often carry more weight than public statements. These reports suggested that their lives were beginning to move in parallel rather than together. Separate routines, separate priorities, separate emotional landscapes. It was not a sudden break, but a gradual drifting apart. And what made it more striking was how seamlessly it was concealed. Because in their world, appearances are not just maintained, they are perfected. Every gesture, every interaction, every moment is shaped to reflect stability, even when stability no longer exists beneath the surface. Within elite circles, the disconnect was not entirely unnoticed. It was acknowledged, but rarely discussed openly. Conversations remained careful, measured, often incomplete. There was an understanding, almost unspoken, that something had shifted, but also a recognition that certain truths were not meant to be examined too closely. And yet, the more time passed, the more difficult it became to ignore what was quietly unfolding. Because distance, once it takes hold, does not remain static. It grows. It deepens. It begins to influence everything around it. At the same time, another shift was taking place, one that would prove to be just as significant. Camilla's presence within the royal orbit was becoming more pronounced. Her connection to Charles III, once a matter of quiet history, was increasingly intersecting with the present, and as that connection grew more visible, it added a new layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. Because it was no longer just about a marriage experiencing distance, it was about overlapping worlds, unresolved histories, and emotional ties that refused to remain in the past. And through all of this, Andrew's silence became more telling than any statement could have been. He did not confront the narrative. He did not challenge the perception. Instead, he remained composed, reserved, almost detached. And in doing so, he allowed the story to unfold without interference. But silence, especially in a situation like this, is rarely empty. It carries meaning. It suggests awareness. It hints at an understanding that does not need to be spoken to be real. And as the distance between them continued to grow, that silence began to feel less like restraint and more like acceptance of something that could no longer be changed. Because by this point, the pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible, undeniable, and quietly acknowledged by those closest to the situation. What had once been dismissed as minor inconsistencies had evolved into something far more significant, a clear indication that the foundation of the marriage was shifting in ways that could not be reversed. And yet, even as this reality became clearer, the most critical moment had not yet arrived, because distance alone does not define an ending. It prepares the ground for something else, something deeper, more decisive, and far more difficult to ignore. But the real turning point didn't come from distance, it came from something far more difficult to ignore. And every relationship has a moment, the one where everything shifts, where silence becomes impossible. For Andrew Parker Bowles, insiders suggest that moment wasn't sudden, it was inevitable. And when it finally came, it didn't just expose a fracture, it revealed the truth everyone had been avoiding. By this stage, the quiet distance that had once lingered in the background was no longer subtle. It had grown into something undeniable, something that could be felt even in the most controlled interactions. Those close to the situation have long suggested that there was no single dramatic incident, no explosive confrontation that shattered everything at once. Instead, it was an accumulation, a slow, relentless build of moments, realizations, and emotional shifts that eventually reached a point where they could no longer be contained. At the center of this turning point was a reality that had been quietly developing for years. The connection between Queen Camilla and Charles III was no longer something that existed only in the past. It had moved forward, evolving into something present, something active, something impossible to ignore. What had once been framed as history now carried the weight of the present, and that shift changed everything. Because when a connection like that reemerges with such clarity, it does not remain isolated. It begins to affect every surrounding relationship, every expectation, every carefully maintained balance. For Andrew, this was not a sudden discovery. It was a realization that had been forming quietly, shaped by observation rather than confrontation. Insiders often suggest that he was not unaware of what was happening. In fact, his growing detachment seems to reflect an understanding that had been reached long before it was ever acknowledged publicly. There is a difference between not knowing and choosing not to challenge what is known, and in this case, that distinction became increasingly significant. Because his response was not explosive. It was measured, controlled, almost restrained to a fault, and that restraint, rather than diminishing the impact, only made it more powerful. As this dynamic became more visible, the contrast between public appearances and private reality began to sharpen. On the surface, everything remained composed. Appearances were maintained, roles were fulfilled, and the narrative remained intact. But beneath that surface, the contradictions were becoming harder to ignore. Interactions that once seemed ordinary now carried an underlying tension. Moments that had once passed unnoticed now felt charged with meaning. And those within their social circle who had once chosen to look away could no longer fully dismiss what they were seeing. The shift was not confined to private spaces. It began to ripple outward, subtly influencing perceptions within elite circles. Conversations that had once been careful and restrained started to carry a different tone, more direct, more acknowledging of what had previously been left unsaid. The reality of the situation was no longer something that could be quietly contained. It was becoming part of the collective understanding, even if it was never formally addressed. And as that understanding spread, it created a sense of inevitability that was impossible to escape. Andrew's detachment deepened during this time, but it did not come across as defeat. Instead, it felt like acceptance and acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted beyond the point of return. His silence, once interpreted as loyalty or restraint, now seemed to carry a different meaning. It suggested recognition. It suggested that the outcome had already been understood long before it was ever made visible to the outside world. And in that quiet acceptance, there was a sense that the relationship had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, because this was the moment where everything changed, not through confrontation, but through clarity. A clarity that exposed what had long been hidden beneath layers of expectation and carefully maintained appearances. It was the point where the balance could no longer be sustained, where the contradictions became too significant to ignore, and where the future of the relationship was no longer uncertain. It was, in every sense, the beginning of an irreversible shift. And once that shift began, there was no dramatic collapse, no sudden ending, only a slow, deliberate unraveling that would quietly redefine everything that followed. What followed wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a quiet unraveling that would redefine everything. There were no explosive headlines at first, no dramatic announcements, just a quiet shift, subtle, controlled, almost surgical. But behind that calm exterior, something irreversible had already taken place. By the time the change became noticeable, it had already been unfolding for longer than anyone outside their inner world could fully understand. This was not the kind of ending that demanded attention. It did not arrive with confrontation or chaos. Instead, it moved with precision, as if carefully guided to avoid disruption. And that, perhaps, is what made it more powerful. Because when something significant ends without noise, it forces those watching to look closer, to question what they might have missed. The separation between Andrew Parker Bowles and Queen Camilla did not present itself as a single moment. It was gradual, unfolding in stages so subtle that each one could be explained on its own. A shift in routine, a change in presence, a quiet adjustment in how they appeared together or didn't. To the public, it remained composed, almost untouched by the kind of disruption that usually accompanies the end of a long-standing relationship. But within their private world, the acknowledgement had already taken hold. The realization that what once existed could no longer continue had settled in, not as a shock, but as a quiet certainty. Efforts to maintain composure were not just expected, they were essential. In a world shaped by tradition and perception, the absence of scandal is often as deliberate as the presence of stability. Every interaction, every appearance, every decision carried the weight of that expectation. And so, even as the relationship shifted beyond repair, the exterior remained intact. Conversations remained measured. Roles were fulfilled. The image was preserved. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, there was an understanding that could not be undone. Because once a relationship reaches that point of recognition, it does not return to what it was before. The pressure to avoid disruption extended beyond the individuals themselves. It came from the structure they existed within, a system that values continuity above all else. Within that system, personal realities are often managed in ways that prioritize stability over exposure. And in this case, that meant allowing the separation to unfold quietly, without drawing attention to the deeper reasons behind it. Those closest to the situation were aware. They understood the shift, even if it was never openly addressed. There was no need for public confirmation, no demand for explanation. The end was acknowledged in private, where it could remain controlled. Throughout this process, Andrew's silence remained consistent, but now it carried a different weight. It was no longer just restraint, it was dignity. A deliberate choice to step back without disrupting what had already been set into motion. His composure did not suggest indifference. If anything, it suggested a deeper understanding of what the situation required. Because sometimes, the strongest response is not confrontation, but acceptance. And in that acceptance, there was a quiet strength that shaped how the transition unfolded. At the same time, Camilla's path began to move in a different direction, one that was becoming increasingly defined by her connection to Charles III. What had once existed as a complicated history was now aligning with the present in a way that could no longer be separated from her future. This alignment was not abrupt. It developed gradually, mirroring the same quiet progression that defined the end of her marriage. But its significance was undeniable, because it represented not just a shift in personal circumstances, but a redefinition of her role within a much larger narrative. By the time the separation was fully realized, it had already been accepted by those closest to it. There was no dramatic conclusion, no moment of finality that could be clearly identified. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that what had once held everything together no longer existed, and in its place, something new had already begun to take shape, something that would eventually become far more visible, far more defined, and far more difficult to ignore. But even as that new reality emerged, the deeper story remained hidden beneath layers of silence and controlled perception. And yet, even after it was over, the real story remained buried until now. For 3 decades, he said nothing. No interviews, no corrections, no clarifications, just silence. Which is why, when Andrew Parker Bowles finally spoke, even subtly, it carried a weight few could ignore. Silence, in a world built on carefully managed narratives, is never empty. It is deliberate. It protects. It conceals. And for years, his silence was interpreted as loyalty, as discipline, as a quiet agreement to let the official version of events remain untouched. But now, looking back, that silence feels different. It feels loaded, as if it had been holding something in place, waiting for the moment when it could finally loosen its grip. The question that lingers is not just what he said, but why he chose to say it now. Because timing, in the world of royalty, is rarely accidental. Over the years, the landscape surrounding the monarchy has shifted. The distance between public perception and private reality has narrowed. Stories that once remained confined to whispers have found their way into broader conversations. And within that changing environment, there is a growing sense that certain truths can no longer remain buried indefinitely. It is within this context that Andrew's quiet confirmation begins to take on a deeper meaning. It does not stand alone, it connects to a larger shift, one that has been unfolding gradually but is now becoming impossible to ignore. For decades, the narrative surrounding his marriage to Queen Camilla remained stable, almost fixed in place. It was understood, accepted, rarely questioned. But stability, when built on incomplete truths, can only hold for so long. Insiders have long suggested that there were layers to that story, details that were known within certain circles, but never brought into the open. And now, with even a subtle acknowledgement from Andrew himself, those layers are beginning to align. Past rumors that once felt speculative now seem connected, forming a clearer picture of what may have been unfolding beneath the surface all along. What makes this moment particularly striking is how restrained it is. There is no dramatic revelation, no explicit declaration, just a shift, a small but significant movement that invites interpretation rather than demanding it. And in some ways, that makes it more powerful, because it forces those paying attention to fill in the gaps, to revisit the past with a new perspective, to question what was once taken at face value. It transforms silence into context, absence into meaning, and as that reinterpretation takes place, the story itself begins to change. Public reaction to this delayed revelation has been shaped by that very ambiguity. Some see it as confirmation of what they had long suspected. Others view it as a reminder of how much remains unspoken within the royal world. But regardless of interpretation, there is a shared recognition that something has shifted, that the narrative is no longer as fixed as it once seemed. Because when a story that has remained unchanged for so long begins to move, even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond the initial moment. And at the center of it all is the power of timing. Because had these words or implications emerged years earlier, they might have been dismissed, overshadowed, or even suppressed. But now, they arrive in a different context, one where the audience is more willing to question, to analyze, to look beyond the surface. And in that context, even the smallest confirmation can carry immense significance. It becomes not just a reflection of the past, but a key to understanding it. Because this was never just about what happened, it was about how it was perceived, how it was presented, and how it was ultimately understood. And now, with that understanding beginning to shift, the entire narrative feels less certain, less controlled, more open to interpretation than ever before. But his words didn't just explain the past, they reshaped how the entire story is now understood. For years, the narrative seemed settled. The past was the past. The future had already been written. But now, with this new perspective emerging, everything feels less certain. What once appeared as a closed chapter is beginning to shift under closer examination. Not because entirely new information has surfaced, but because existing pieces are being seen through a different lens. And when that happens, when a long-accepted story is quietly reevaluated, it does not simply adjust the past. It reshapes how the present is understood. In the case of Queen Camilla, this shift is particularly striking because her public image has undergone one of the most carefully managed transformations in modern royal history. There was a time when her position within the broader narrative was defined by controversy, by tension, by a sense that her story existed in conflict with something larger than herself. That perception, however, did not remain fixed. Over time, it evolved slowly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly at first. Public appearances became more measured, more consistent. The narrative softened. The focus shifted from past complications to present responsibilities. And gradually, the image that once carried uncertainty began to take on a different tone, one of acceptance, even respect in certain circles. But transformations like this do not happen by chance. They are shaped, guided, and carefully sustained. This is where the complexity deepens. Because while the public narrative moved toward stability, the underlying questions never fully disappeared. They lingered quietly, resurfacing in moments of reflection, in conversations that revisited earlier chapters of the story. The contrast between past controversies and present roles created a tension that was never entirely resolved. It was simply managed, and for many, that management was enough. It allowed the story to move forward without being anchored too heavily in what came before. But now, with the subtle reemergence of perspectives like that of Andrew Parker Bowles, those earlier questions are finding new relevance. Public reaction to this shift has been layered, reflecting the complexity of the narrative itself. On one hand, there is recognition of how far the story has come, how much has changed over time. On the other, there is a renewed curiosity about what may have been overlooked or simplified in the process. Sympathy, understanding, and lingering doubt exist side by side, creating a response that is far from uniform. And that is perhaps the most revealing aspect of all, because it shows that the narrative, despite its apparent stability, was never entirely settled. It was simply accepted as complete until now. What becomes increasingly clear is the role of narrative management within the monarchy itself. Over decades, stories are not just told, they are shaped, refined, and, at times, quietly redirected. This does not necessarily mean they are untrue, but it does mean they are presented in a way that serves a larger purpose. Stability, continuity, and public confidence are all part of that purpose. And within that framework, certain details may be emphasized while others remain in the background. It is a process that requires precision, patience, and an understanding of how perception evolves over time. Now, with Andrew's perspective subtly entering the conversation, that carefully maintained balance is being tested, not in a dramatic or disruptive way, but in a manner that invites reconsideration. It encourages people to look again, to connect past and present in ways that were not previously explored. And in doing so, it adds a new layer to a story that once seemed complete, because legacy within the monarchy is never simple. It is built over time, shaped by actions, perceptions, and the narratives that surround them. And as this narrative continues to evolve, one thing becomes undeniable: the story is not fixed. It never truly was. It is shaped by perspective, influenced by timing, and defined by the way it is understood at any given moment. Because in the world of royalty, perception isn't just important, it defines everything. In the end, it wasn't a scandal that brought the truth forward. It wasn't a headline or a revelation. It was time. Because some stories don't disappear, they wait. They settle into the background, woven into the fabric of public memory, quietly shaping perception without ever fully revealing themselves. And within the royal world, where silence often carries as much meaning as words, those stories can remain untouched for decades, preserved not by force, but by agreement, an understanding that some things are better left undisturbed. Yet time has a way of unsettling even the most carefully protected narratives, not by exposing them all at once, but by slowly changing how they are seen. What once felt distant begins to feel relevant again. What was accepted without question starts to invite curiosity. And in that shift, the past does not change, but the way it is understood does. The story of Andrew Parker Bowles and Queen Camilla is no exception. For years, it existed as a closed chapter, something acknowledged but rarely revisited in depth. But as time moves forward, that sense of finality begins to fade. Not because new facts have dramatically emerged, but because perspective has evolved. And when perspective changes, even the most familiar stories can feel entirely different. Andrew's role in this transformation is striking precisely because of its subtlety. He did not seek to redefine the narrative through bold declarations or public statements. Instead, his influence came through quiet implication, through the gradual easing of a silence that had been maintained for so long, and in doing so, he allowed space for reinterpretation. A space where past assumptions could be reconsidered, where overlooked details could take on new meaning. It was not an act of disruption, it was an act of quiet revelation, one that carried weight because of everything that had come before it. At the heart of this story lies a tension that has always existed within the monarchy: the balance between personal truth and public duty. Relationships are not just personal within that world, they are part of a larger structure, one that demands stability, continuity, and control. And within that structure, sacrifices are often made, not always visibly, but with lasting impact. The intersection of love, duty, and expectation is rarely simple, and in this case, it created a dynamic that could not be easily resolved. It required time, it required distance, and ultimately, it required a shift in how the story was allowed to be seen. For the royal family, the implications of this evolving narrative extend beyond a single relationship. They touch on the way legacy is shaped, on how history is preserved, and on the role perception plays in defining both. Because legacy is not just built on events, it is built on interpretation, on the stories that are told, the ones that are left untold, and the way those stories are understood over time. And as this particular narrative continues to be revisited, it becomes part of a larger conversation about how the monarchy navigates its own past. What makes this moment particularly powerful is its quietness. There is no dramatic conclusion, no definitive statement that closes the story once and for all. Instead, there is a sense of ongoing reflection, a recognition that some truths are not meant to be revealed all at once. They emerge gradually, shaped by time and perspective, until they become impossible to ignore. And in that process, the story transforms not into something entirely new, but into something more complete. Because in the end, the most enduring stories are not the ones that are loudly declared. They are the ones that remain, waiting beneath the surface, shaping understanding long before they are ever fully acknowledged. And perhaps that is what makes this story so compelling. Not the events themselves, but the way they have been carried, preserved, and finally allowed to surface in a way that feels both inevitable and long overdue. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is realizing how long the truth had been there, waiting to be seen. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.